Greetings and welcome to our first of many series entitled Managing Our Anxiety, a 21st Century Application. I am Dr. Marjorie Lewis, a marriage and family therapist and licensed addictions counselor in the state of Colorado, which, by the way, I am proud to say recently turned from red to blue. We are going to be sharing with you insights as they identify the issue of anxiety. We are going to define it. We are going to look at ways to manage it. We are going to correlate it relative to emotions. And we're going to just become very sophisticated about this, I'll call it culprit, called anxiety. Why would I say that? Well, when you think about, say, the religious literature, when you think about religious dogma, every religion talks in terms of what? Managing anxiety. We're told to be anxious for nothing, but in all things through prayer and supplication, make your requests known to God, the universe, the great I am. In relation to Eastern religions, we are sort of instructed on how to meditate and pray and how to move ourselves in mindsets that allow us to manage anxiety. When we talk about anxiety, a lot of times we misdefine it, correlating it with anger, correlating it with fear. Anxiety in and of itself is not an emotion. It is the response to a perspective. And that perspective is flawed because we are seeing ourselves as vulnerable. Think about it. Whenever you and I see ourselves as separate, see ourselves within the context of being the only ones available to handle a situation or to get a job done, we begin to feel just a bit vulnerable because in this big, wide world, the energy, the desires, the attempts of one person really can be feeble. And when we see ourselves as separated, we see ourselves as vulnerable. And when we see ourselves as vulnerable, we begin to get stressed out. We begin to become anxious. Anxiety and the perception of vulnerability are highly correlated. So as we begin to explore this mystery, I'll call it, of anxiety, we are going to learn how to think better. We're going to learn how to transfer what I call irrational belief systems that are ego-driven in order to minimize the impact of anxiety. Now, for many of us, we believe that anxiety itself cannot be eradicated. It simply can be managed. So we are going to look at techniques that we can use to minimize our anxiety. Part of this series will include defining the anxiety as well as seeing how it sort of causes us disutility, heartbreak, heartache, problems. We're also going to look at, in depth, the religious response to anxiety. We're going to look at various religions and see exactly what they have to say about anxiety to prove what? They don't like anxiety any more than we should. We're also going to then identify managerial approaches, and we're going to look at some of the theories relative to why we would want to manage anxiety and how we go about managing anxiety. And finally, we're going to see some demonstrations. We're going to actually show you how to use very simple techniques to just stay cool, calm, and relaxed. I want to just talk about anxiety. I want to define it for you. And I would really be curious about your thoughts in relation to its definition. I want to invite you to call or send mail to give us feedback about the program and perhaps some ideas or some questions that you might have. Think about something that makes you nervous or uncomfortable or causes you stress. When you think about it, there's probably a perception of vulnerability. And that perception of vulnerability is the very thing that invokes a response of anxiety. Anxiety in and of itself is not a particular emotion. It is a response to a perception of vulnerability. Whenever I perceive myself to be vulnerable, my stress level goes up. And for purposes of this presentation, we're going to correlate the stress level with anxiety. My stress level goes up because what? I see the need to protect myself, and too often I don't see my ability to correlate with the need. I need to protect myself, but I don't know how. So what happens? My stress level goes up. Whenever I'm feeling vulnerable, I see a need for protection, and I perceive that it is not there. And that's what goes on with the whole issue of anxiety. I see myself as vulnerable, and I don't see myself able to do anything about it. Now, when we think about anxiety and, say, the 4 basic emotions, I liken happy, sad, angry, and afraid to, say, the 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow. They're primary colors, and if you combine them, you can get the whole prism of colors. Well, it's the same with emotion. You got happy, sad, angry, and afraid. And if you look at a continuum for each one of those, and you say, talk in terms of levels of intensity or combinations among the 4 emotions, you probably could come up with almost every emotion that exists. If you have the time, just try it. Take happy and mix it with sad, and see what you get. Take anger and mix it with happy, see what you get. Take fear and mix it with sadness, see what you get. But know this, sad and anxious are not the same thing. Fear and anxiety are not the same thing. Anxiety contaminates the emotions. Anxiety stands alone in its ability to universally contaminate emotions. Now, when you and I see ourselves as vulnerable, there's one factor about our being that is at work, and it's called the ego. Now, many of us know enough about the ego to know that it's not a very positive function in our lives. Think about the concept of self-image. A self-image is a function of your ego. Your ego is the part of you that is responsible for creating, maintaining, and protecting your self-image. But think about the word, self-image. It is not your true self. It is an image of yourself. It is a model of yourself. It is a presentation. And preoccupation with that presentation, preoccupation with that model is the job of the ego. The ego exists to protect us. The ego exists to help us navigate our way through this earthly existence. The ego can be a great friend, but it must be controlled. Many of us miss out on a lot of opportunities because we yield to our ego. You have arrogant people, big egos. You have people who are very reticent, very shy, big egos. Anytime I am preoccupied with who I am, and when I see myself separated from other people, and so into myself, my ego is at work. My ego is about you, about me, and me alone. Your ego is about you and you alone. Our ego does not deal with being connected, working together. Our ego is what motivates competition. Our ego is what motivates envy and jealousy. Our ego is what would drive us to what? Keep up with the Joneses. Our ego is what would keep us from asking for help for fear of what people would think about us. Our ego is that part of us that would encourage us to try to go it alone. The ego, believe me, is not your friend. And whenever we have an inflated ego, which would be a situation where if anyone were to look your way, you would assume they're looking at you. A fat ego, a big ego, an inflated ego is also a frail ego. It is very frail. It is so frail that anything could upset it. It could hurt it. And for that reason, we often misbehave because of the fact that we have inflated egos. Imagine sitting at a table, facing people, and everybody's frowning at you. Everybody's frowning at you. And your ego is busy. Now, your ego doesn't see you connected to these people. Your ego may see these people as your enemies, because usually if you don't feel connected, it's just a matter of time before the person with whom we are disconnected becomes our enemy. We don't have anything in common. Our ego knows how to work that show. But imagine people at the table looking at you. You're in the hot seat, so to speak. You're facing them. They're looking at you and they're frowning. Or they have this stern look. And they have this disapproving look. Now, this is your interpretation of the look. And your interpretation is a function of the vulnerability of your ego. If your ego is working, it's going to see you as separate from these people and probably will see the stares as negative. However, let's add this to the scenario. Perhaps the people really aren't looking at you. Perhaps they're trying to read something that might happen to be on the wax board behind, and it's hard to read, so they have to kind of squint. You know, perhaps the person just has a headache, and they just aren't feeling well that day. Perhaps that's why they're frowning. Whatever the reason, perhaps it's not even about you, but your ego has captured every look and internalized it. It has personalized it, and here we are, sitting in front of a bunch of people that we have concluded are frowning at us. And they're not even focusing on us. They just happen to be looking our way. And they have a headache, trying to read the board. But our frail ego, our big ego, stretches from one end of the room to the other. And within the context of that, whatever they're throwing our way, our egos catch. And here we are, looking with the ego and beginning to feel just a bit vulnerable, just a bit unsafe, just a bit at risk. Perhaps not physically, but certainly emotionally. This is a problem that correlates with being anxious. Ego and anxiety go hand in hand. Ego and feeling vulnerable because we perceive ourselves as separate go hand in hand. The bigger my ego, the higher the probability that I'm going to see myself vulnerable, separated, fearful. The higher the probability that my stress level is going to go up. The higher the probability that anxiety is going to be plaguing my life. Anxiety is the result of a perception of vulnerability. And the perception of vulnerability comes when my ego is successfully separating me from my surroundings. When we think about anxiety and we think about what it does to our emotions, we need to realize that it not only contaminates emotions, it also contaminates our ability to think. But before we move into the cognitive part, let's just look at the emotions. Now remember, we have 4 primary emotions: happy, sad, angry, and afraid. Even I am programmed to think that happy is number 1. Every time I mention emotions, I always say happy first. But happy is no better or worse than the other three. The issue is not the other three emotions. The issue is anxiety. Now let's imagine that we're cooking moose stew or a stew, and we're getting flavorings. And we've decided that we want to have some happy in the flavoring. So we put a dab of happy in the stew, and then let's put a little anxiety in the stew. So we put happy in the stew and anxiety to flavor it. And the flavor that's going to come out is excitement. Happy combined with anxiety results in excitement. Now, excitement seems like a positive thing, and perhaps it is. But let's look at what would happen if we had happy and perhaps the flavoring of peace, or the flavoring that comes with spirituality. And when you combine happy with a peaceful state of mind, you come out with this thing that we call being pleased. Now you look at the condition of being pleased as a function of happy, and then consider the condition of being excited. They are very, very different relative to the impact on our energy levels, our physical fitness, our well-being. Excitement is often mistaken for being nervous or afraid. The problem is, I'm not nervous or afraid except when I see myself as vulnerable. And when I'm happy and I'm seeing myself as vulnerable, anxiety kicks in and I become excited. Imagine getting married, bride or groom, doesn't matter. Groom or groom, bride or bride, doesn't matter. Imagine it's your wedding day and you are about to enter the room, or you're waiting, anticipating your bride-to-be. You're feeling excited. You're happy, but you're kind of vulnerable, especially if you're a bride, especially if there's a big wedding, especially if you've been preparing and preparing and preparing, especially when everything is not under your control. Anything could go wrong. Yes, you are happy, but you're feeling very vulnerable. And so you're probably a very excited bride. And well, you should be, because you see yourself as a bit vulnerable, but it's the happiest day of your life, or let's hope it is. So here we are, happy, but feeling vulnerable, and so we're excited. Now, Grandma is in the room, and she's attending your wedding. She just flew in from her Orient Express trip, so she's pretty cooled out. She didn't have to bother with the wedding. There were no details that she had to, consider or even grapple with. So she comes in after a good night's sleep, and she's just there waiting for the festivities to happen. And, everything seems very pleasant and seems perfect, and she's pleased. She's happy about the wedding, very much so. But she doesn't have anything to worry about. She doesn't have any reason to feel vulnerable. She just got her health checkup. The doc says she's going to be living for 20 more years. She's very pleased. Here, you and I are, excited brides-to-be, and our grandma is sitting there just as pleased as punch. Now, both of us are happy, but one of us is excited, and the other is pleased. And so you have a you have a lot of space between excited and pleased, but both of them are at perhaps opposite ends of the continuum of happy. And the thing that moves pleased to excitement or excitement to pleased is the level of anxiety associated with the emotion. The bride is feeling very anxious and happy. The grandma's feeling very peaceful and happy. The bride is excited and the grandma is pleased. So we have an example of what anxiety can do to the emotion happy. Now you might ask, what is the purpose of the emotion happy? Why are we happy? Well, happy in its functional form, being pleased, allows us to share and to receive openly and readily. You ever wonder why, when there's bad news, Grandma would cook Granddad's favorite dinner before she told him the bad news? Because she had to put him in a pleasing mood. And remember when, say, Grandpa would talk about how he courted Grandma and he would bring her flowers. Why would he do that? To please her so that she would receive him. You see, when we are pleased, we are easily led to give and to receive information, gifts, etc. And that's the function of happy. But it functions on the end of the spectrum that correlates happy with peace. Now, let's take the anxiety, the other end of it. You and I, excited. What happens? We're not giving. Oh, no. And we're really not receiving very well. We're stressed out, but we're happy, so we're excited. When I'm excited, I'm not very valuable. I am putting the spotlight or the center of attention on me, and people have to do the best they can to kind of keep me calm or at least get into me. I'm not giving and I'm not receiving. I'm preoccupied with myself, and I'm feeling quite vulnerable about the situation. Not a very healthy way to be. And then you have three other emotions. Sad. Let's take sad. Sad is the kind of emotion that allows us to repair breaches. It allows us to reflect on losses, not to stay in the experience of grief, but to sort of reflect on it in order to grow from it. That's what sadness is supposed to do. Now, let's take some anxiety and mix it in with the sadness. You know what's going to happen. We move from being sad to being depressed. And when we are depressed, we are not responsive to our environment. We don't go to work, we don't take care of the kids, we don't clean the house, we don't clean the car, we don't feel like playing football or basketball with the guys. All we want to do is sit around and mope at home. And I'm sure that you can think of many scenarios, TV show perhaps where the guy loses the girl and all he's doing is moping around, or vice versa. That's a form of depression. It is not helping with the loss. It is not moving us ahead because of the loss. We are not responding to our environment, a very dysfunctional way of being. And the reason why we're not dealing with the loss is because we feel very vulnerable relative to the loss. So we move into depression. Now, let's take a peaceful state and combine that with the emotion of sadness. Well, you know, I'm not as active, I'm not as energetic as I normally am, but I'm here. I'm at work, I'm at play, I'm here. A bit melancholy, yes. Sorrowful might be a good word. But I'm here. And I'm responding, and I'm sort of having something on my mind. There's something on my mind. So I'm not as responsive to you as I could be, but I'm responsive enough to be functional. I'm still taking care of the kids. I'm getting the car washed. I'm cleaning the house. I'm cleaning myself. Why? Because I have peace in it. I can have peace in my saddened state. I'm melancholy. I'm sorrowful. But I'm functioning. And in that state, I can explore the loss. I can reconcile the loss. And that's the function of being sad when it is in a functional state. But when anxiety comes, it moves it to depression, and it becomes very, very dysfunctional. Let's take the emotion fear. Now that one we tend to downgrade and downplay, and we say, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. Well, you know, fear isn't a bad thing. Fear is not your enemy. Anxiety is your enemy. So let's mix a little fear with anxiety. And what do we have? Terror. Terror is the thing that immobilizes. Terror is the thing that causes us to misjudge. Terror is the thing that has us jumping at our shadows, accidentally bumping our heads, not fear. Think about fear and peace. A functional form of fear would be alertness. You see, when something captures my attention and I become alert, that allows me to focus on perhaps something that has to be addressed. Terror will have me frozen in my tracks like a deer in headlights. Alertness will allow me to identify it, pay attention to it, and conquer it. You've heard the term making a mountain out of a molehill. Well, if I am functioning inappropriately with fear, I'm going to make a mountain out of that molehill. And here's how it works. I see a little molehill, and I begin to pay attention to it. And in my anxious state, I take it out of context. And all I'm doing is focusing on the molehill. I'm not looking at the surroundings. I'm not realizing that the molehill is really small, because I've taken it out of context. And all I'm focusing on is the molehill. So what happens? It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And sooner or later, it grows out of proportion because I've taken it out of context. I don't see it in relation to the blades of grass or the bushes or the trees. I just see the molehill. And what's going to happen? I become myopic. And in that, I feel more and more vulnerable, to the point where I am terrorized about the situation. But you see, if I had not taken it out of context, if I had not mixed anxiety in it, I would have been able to see the molehill realistically. And I would have been able to look at it in context, because I'm alert. You see, when I'm terrorized, I'm focused on one item. When I'm alert, I'm paying attention to the item, but I haven't become myopic, so I can keep things in perspective. And when I can keep things in perspective that command my attention, I can do what it takes to conquer whatever the problem is. But if anxiety comes in, it's going to move me to what? Focus too extremely on the problem, and before you know it, the problem has grown, and here I am terrorized about a problem that's really not as big as it appears. And if I would relax a bit and become alerted to the issue, I could see it in context, and I could probably handle it. I wouldn't avoid it. I wouldn't dread it. I wouldn't fear it. I wouldn't be terrorized about it. I would be alerted to it to handle it. That's what fear combined with peace can do. But fear combined with anxiety results in procrastination, other forms of resistance, because we've made a big deal out of it. We've focused on it. So we have happy and we have fear. Let's look at anger. That's a good one. That's a really popular one in this society. We have all kinds of anger management classes, don't we? Well, I don't mean to seem disrespectful to the anger management gurus, but I'm sure you know as well as I do that anger is not the issue. Never has been, never will be. It's the rage that's the issue. The rage. And that is the result of mixing the spices of anger and anxiety. When we mix anger and anxiety, we wind up with rage. When I am feeling anger, what am I feeling? Functional form, irritation. Irritation is a form of anger. It's a very functional form of anger. It's the kind of feeling that I am going to experience when I'm at peace, but I'm angry. I'm irritated. And when I become irritated, I'm motivated to move on a situation. I'm motivated to resolve a situation. When I am angry and feeling at risk, when I am angry and feeling separated, I tend to become raged. And instead of resolving the source of my anger, I destroy the source of my anger. So what would you rather have? Would you rather have someone irritated with you or enraged with you? Which one would you rather be, irritated or enraged? The choice is really yours. It's really a function of how connected are you feeling to this person at this moment. If you're feeling very disconnected, if the ego is on its job, if something happens to irritate you or something happens to cause anger, you're going to move what? Into a rage. But if I'm feeling connected to you, and if my ego is on a diet and it's really not available to be attacked, then I'm probably going to be irritated about something, which means I'm not going to like it, but I'm not going to kill you because you did it. Irritation, rage. Peace and anxiety. Two extremes relative to the emotion anger. Anxiety is the culprit. It is the issue. It is that piece of our being that will throw us under the bus because it is in partnership with ego. Now, I want to explore anxiety a little further in relation to this sensing of vulnerability yet again. What does it mean to feel vulnerable? What does it mean to perceive yourself as vulnerable? Well, Albert Ellis would call it an irrational belief, I believe. He would see it as a dysfunctional perspective. A lot of people have low self-efficacy, which is an inability to perceive themselves in control of their environment. A lot of people think they can't do many things well. And with that mindset, a low level of self-efficacy, I am going to see myself as very vulnerable. We call it the victim mentality. I have no control over my life. I never get it my way. Oh, and by the way, it's never my fault. A victim mentality is going to see him or herself as very vulnerable, very disempowered, very out of control of their behavior. And when I am seeing myself in the eyes of suffering from low self-efficacy, I am going to feel very anxious, very, very anxious. In our business of addiction counseling, the victim mentality is a very dominant personality trait. There's another one that correlates with the whole issue of feeling vulnerable, and that's one who is a persecutor. They're always going to get you back. They're always feeling as though you did them wrong. The problem is they went too far in the giving, and they had unrealistic expectations, and when those expectations are not met, they are ready to murder you because they feel betrayed. They feel that you are their enemy. They feel very disconnected. They feel very vulnerable. After all I did for you, and look at what you're doing to me. Again, this dysfunctional, irrational belief system will move us from being very functional to being very dysfunctional, wanting to persecute, act out, hurt, get back people that we perceive did us wrong. You also have another personality type in our groups, and that's the rescuer. And the rescuer is the one who's acting out of perceived vulnerability, low level of self-efficacy. They don't know it. They're always over-giving. You see, it's one thing to give what you can afford to give. It's another thing to give when you can't afford to give. And the rescuer is always giving beyond their capacity. They're the kind of person who got a mortgage payment due, but their friend needed a few $100s, so they gave some of their mortgage money to help their friend, and then they turn into a persecutor when the friend doesn't do something for them. The rescuer is the one who perhaps lives in a four-bedroom apartment with 3 kids, right? Or a 4-room apartment, I'm sorry. 4-bedroom apartment would be awfully large, wouldn't it? But it's a 4-room apartment, they got 3 kids, and then perhaps somebody comes along, perhaps in group, and they need a place to stay, and that person has 2 kids. Who's going to invite them? The rescuer. They don't really have the room, but they will give beyond their capacity. And believe it or not, that's a function of ego, and it's a function of vulnerability. The giving has a string attached, people, and you can always tell a person who has that rescuer mentality, and when they start getting nervous, they start naming everything that they did for you. And this implies what? They're not feeling connected to you anymore. They've got to remind you. They start playing tit for tat. If I play a tit for tat game with you, which would be I give to you, you give to me, that is robotic, and it is not a form of me feeling at one with you or connected. And so within the context of anxiety, anxiety drives all 3 of those personality types: the victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor. All 3 of those personality types see themselves as vulnerable relative to other people, circumstances, and events. And so, just wanting you to begin to understand how anxiety can result in behavioral dysfunctions and irrational belief systems. When we identify the whole issue of anxiety, we can correlate it with stress, you see. Stress is a response that we identify as the silent killer. It causes high blood pressure, hypertension, which can result in strokes and heart attacks. Can also be correlated with cancer. These diseases that result from stress could be avoided if we would identify the real culprit, which is a perception of vulnerability, a perception of separation that results in anxiety. Anxiety is dysfunctional, or causes our emotions to become dysfunctional, as well as our cognitive processes, our ability to process thoughts. Why? Because our emotion moves us out of the relaxed state that allows our thoughts to drive our feelings. Instead, our contaminated feelings drive our thoughts. This is dysfunctional, and it can be very costly. In order to think well, in order to process thoughts well, in order for our cognition to be optimized, our anxiety has to be minimized. So anxiety is what I call the dysfunctional glue that attaches our dysfunctional emotions to our thought processes, contaminating the thought processes such that we indulge in irrational belief systems. We indulge in inappropriate deduction. That's why when there is a dangerous situation, the key is to what? Keep cool, calm, and collected. I don't want to get myopic. I don't want to see myself as separate. I don't want to see this molehill as a mountain. I don't want to take things out of context, and that's what anxiety will do. It will disallow my ability to process thought. I can think when I'm angry. I can think when I'm afraid. I can think when I'm sad, and I can think when I am indulging fear. But I can't think well in any of these emotions when anxiety has contaminated them. And that's the thing to remember. The emotion doesn't have any kind of negative impact on my thinking. All four of them inform my thinking, but anxiety does. And so when we think about anxiety and the implications associated with anxiety, remember that anxiety makes us kind of stupid. You know what I mean? We just don't think well. Anxiety also makes us drama kings and queens because we're always extreme there. And in exploring the definition, we are preparing to look at ways to begin to resolve it. So next week we're going to sort of look at the issue of anxiety and segue into a religious response to anxiety. Get rid of it. It is not your friend. All that having been said, I'm going to end this time together right now and look forward to talking with you again very soon. Thank you for your attention. Enjoy.